Namaskar. I think we are all ready to start. So, first of all, I'd like to begin by saying that it is such a privilege for me to be here amongst all of you through Facebook Live today. These are extraordinary times for everyone and the entire world. No one has ever seen anything of such magnitude. So, I hope everyone is maintaining social distancing and all of you are staying indoors as much as possible. um, it's better to be safe than to be sorry. There is no vaccine at the moment, and there won't be any for another 6 months or so, I believe. I'm not sure, but that's what I've heard. And it really is our own responsibility to take care of the vulnerable in our society, like the elderly, in our homes by following the rules of the lockdown, having patience and being sensible, even if the lockdown is extended. I don't know if it will be, but if it is, we must all continue with patience. I hope all of you can hear me. Um, but I'd like to now begin, now that I've given my 2 words of wisdom, I'd like to begin with the topic at hand: racism, counter racism, and historical to present day roots of alienation in the northeast of India. When Rachit contacted me and asked me to take the session with all of you, I was very pleased to hear that young people of your caliber are so interested in national issues, that you would be interested at a time like this during our lockdown to discuss things that concern all of us and have clearly come to light in the last few weeks since the lockdown. I thought we could discuss something that is purely of an academic nature, but but then I thought it would be worth our while to discuss something like this, something that affects and endangers the very fabric that binds our country, and that is racism and its discrimination and alienation, all different words for the same thing. I know most of you are from the Northeast and may have heard of many horror stories in uh, the past from other parts of India. Things like racist attacks and discrimination against Northeastern students and the youth. The most recent one was a dreadful act of a Northeastern girl being spat on in Delhi. And of course, it uh, affected all of us to hear something like this. There was another one recently in Delhi, and I believe that this sort of racial discrimination and this sort of awful behavior has only increased since the beginning of this whole corona pandemic. We've even heard of educated people like doctors uh, racially discriminate against people with mongoloid features. There was one instance in Calcutta where uh, there was this instance where a doctor sent somebody from the northeast back because they had mongoloid features. This really blurs the line between educated, civilized, and uncivilized people. But most of us also know that this is not new. We have seen this sort of discrimination take place in our country over and over again. Yeah, this is an old story. It's being highlighted right now, and we've seen a rise in cases. But therefore, it becomes imperative for us to ask ourselves what are the real reasons behind this sort of discrimination. What is this sort of discrimination based on? Is it just race? Or have we alienated each other to such an extent that, considering that when we came together as a modern nation, There were over 2,000 ethnicities all over India, over 600 tribes that pretty much seamlessly wove into each other. I know it's easy to disregard this by just saying that this is disregard this by just saying that this is bigotry, and we have all sorts of bigotry in different ways in our country. But we really need to ask ourselves: is it all that simple? Is it just as simple as explaining that everybody in India who has this sort of lack of awareness is bigoted? Of course, we agree that there is a certain amount of lack of awareness, and there is a certain amount of lack of knowledge that people have about each other and each other's culture in India. But is that the only reason? Because this is a very, very grave issue. This is a very serious issue. And I don't think, giving it such a superficial sort of idea, reason, justification is good enough. So I think to answer these questions, we must look in a little deeper into the history of the region. We must go to the root of the issue. And to understand these issues of racism, discrimination, and alienation, I'm going to today roughly divide my talk. I have limited time, so I have sort of divided it into two parts. The first part being, which is also the larger part, being colonial history in the Northeast. I'm going to cover the policies within our colonial history in the Northeast, the ILP, Christianity, and the Crown Colony. The second part, which is a smaller part of this talk, and we can continue talking about it in our question answer session, is what is the present day scenario? Where does racism, ghettoization, and individual responsibility fit in? So, to start, let's begin with the British colonial history. Before the British reached the Northeast, there was a wonderful history that tied all of us together. There was a wonderful civilization that tied the entire country together. Today's popular narrative, there's this narrative that the Northeast region is culturally, religiously, ethnically diverse and distant to the rest of India, um, really defies the collective knowledge and comprehension of India's history, India's larger history. India's history doesn't begin from the British colonial conquest of India. It's far larger and wider than that. This is a very divisive narrative, and it overlooks the role of the northeastern population in India's ancient past as well as recent history. For instance, let me give you an example. The Idu Mishmi tribe of Arunachal Pradesh. They trace their lineage to Rukmani, the wife of Krishna. Till date, Idu Rukmani is highly venerated as in Yomasello, or the Great Mother. The Parshuram Kund in Arunachal Pradesh is also mentioned in the Kalika Puran, means as old as that. This was a part of the Northeast was a part of our collective imagination. The Parshuram Kund in Arunachal Pradesh is the lake where Parshuram came to wash his sins away, which is a very, very important uh, event. Hidimba, the wife of Bhima, and the mother of Ghatotkacha of the Mahabharata, were considered to be progenitors of the Kachwe and the Kirat dynasties. Many from the Bodo tribe consider themselves descendants of Brahma, and the Karbi tribe, descendants of Sugriv. The Manipuri princess Chitrangada married Arjuna. The Naga princess Ulupi fell in love with Arjuna and raised his son Babru Bhavan. Ancient Indian literature and history is absolutely replete with such mentions of a robust intercultural respect amongst the people and their indigenous ways of life. as well as a common evolved acceptance of diversity. I mean, um, we think of the Northeast as distant in our imaginations today when things are possibly the closest that they've ever been. But imagine in those days to have this sort of evolved acceptance of geography, of history, of diversity, of civilization. However, somewhere down the line, this narrative was lost, and with the advent of the British, which I personally feel is a singular uh, point in our history that changed a lot of things, changed a lot of ways we view our country, ourselves. Um, the British were driven by their colonizing agenda and ambition to control the Northeast. The Northeast, as you all know and are probably aware, is a very, very strategically located region of India. And the British colonialists, they were very smart. They saw this. Not only did they diminish the value of the ancient Indian collective civilization, but also through the administrative policies, their religious policies, created a psychological sense of distance and alienation between the Northeast and the rest of India. And they did this because they recognized the importance of the Northeast. They recognized the vantage point that they would have had if they controlled the Northeast. Um, One must begin this dialogue by understanding that when the Burmese started their expansion ideas towards India, um, the British colonialists got an opportunity to colonize and expand towards the east. They had surely noticed, like I said before, the opportunities that the Northeast had to offer. Um, let's say tea cultivation was of primary interest. But the geopolitics of this region is very important. Even today, when we look at, when we study topics, when we study politics or religion or ethnicity or uh, the northeastern policies, we must understand the importance of the geopolitical strategic positioning of the Northeast. Um, and the British had obviously also noticed this. They had noticed that the opportunities for trade with Burma, with China, also um, it was a very strategic gateway. It was the opening to the rest of Southeast Asia, but also it was a natural defense barrier. And the colonialists recognized this and they recognized the need to control this area. So, pretty much after the Burmese aggression towards the Northeast, um, and the British playing a very crucial part in defending the Northeast and winning the first Anglo Burmese War, they pretty much occupied Guwahati, and nearly all of the Brahmaputra Valley fell into their hands. And this is very crucial for us to understand the idea of alienation, because it is now when the policy of exclusion and exploitation of the Northeast region begins. It begins by the British. Though the British had obviously previously come into contact with tribal groups from the Northeast, um, they didn't quite understand the ambitions, the aspirations, they didn't quite understand the needs of the northeastern population. They didn't understand the needs of any population that they had colonized, let me tell you this. But especially when they encountered aggressive tribals, let's say, who were very, very closely guarded about their own culture, their own civilization. They didn't quite know how to handle them. And like I will reiterate that this is when the policy of exclusion and exploitation became very, very important to the British. Um, unfortunately for them, the spirit of very independent people. The Northeasterners have always been very, very independent. They didn't take very kindly to the British rule, and there was a lot of conflict. They didn't take kindly to the fact that the British had come in to exploit their resources and to also restrict their free movement in their own land. And the British did this without a concern for the general sentiment of, this very dignified, very independent, very sort of uh, remote people. They weren't like any other population maybe that the British had encountered before. Anyhow, the territorial authority imposed by the British was completely alien. And what also happened was that the ancient egalitarian political administrative systems that tribes in the Northeast and populations in the Northeast had were heavily suppressed and replaced by newer frameworks that destroyed these already existing natural social systems that were very, very closely attached to the Northeastern way of life. And I do understand that the culture, even in the Northeast, I use the word Northeast so that it's easier for me to explain. But of course, the culture in the Northeast also keeps changing. Languages change, ethnicity changes ever so often. But of course, having said that, this sort of administrative framework that was destroyed systematically in all these cultures that represent the Northeast. The British exploited them. They exploited not just them, but their natural resources. They didn't pay any attention to economic and social needs of the population, which further alienated the Northeast from the rest of India. And due to this sort of dismissive attitude towards the tribals, the British were subjected to rampant raids on their trade routes, as well as multiple political uprising against their authority. For example, the Lushai, Kuki, Aka, Khamti resistances, the Naga resistance, the Sonoram movements, Kuki rebellion, the Jaranong Gerilu uprising, it all reflects a very uncomfortable relationship that the Northeast had with its rulers, which were the British at that point. However, to, the British also had many ways to prevent any sort of attacks on them and their authority in the region, and to prevent these raids that the discontent tribes, the populations of these regions had against the British, they created the inner line regulation. And let me say this, the inner line regulation was the first step towards alienating the Northeast from the rest of India. Of course, nowadays we have different ways of looking at it, and we may think that um, it's protecting us. Some of us may have dialogues like that, but when the British brought in the inner line regulation, it was to limit these rates. At the outset, the reason given for this, of course, was to protect the tribes from that interference. I mean, why would you need to protect anybody from their own people? But that was the reason that was given. The ILR was created in honesty, to protect the British interests from the marauding hill tribes, um, who used to loot and kill, and had become really problematic for the British. The ILR demarcated the limits of these administered areas along the northern, eastern, southern, eastern confines of the Brahmaputra Valley. And the British had sought to confine the movement of the tribals and limit outside contact to the tribes. To enter the areas beyond the demarcated area for any purpose, you would have to get a permit. Now imagine how limiting that would have been. And finally, the ILR resulted in segregation. Because if you need a permit to go into your own lands, there is a sense of alienation that comes in, not just towards the people who are within these limitations, but people who are outside these limitations also. There is a sense of alienation that dawns upon them that this is it's like having a passport. Would you like to have a passport to enter any other part of your own country? And this became a massive hindrance in the integration. The ILR became this sort of a limitation that when India eventually became a modern nation, it had uh, to integrate with the rest of India. And we still are seeing the results of this limitation today. Second, the creation of excluded and partially excluded areas also added to the alienation of these tribes from the rest of the country. The British were really narrow minded. Instead of mitigating with these tribes, instead of going into a dialogue, considering they had some of the best anthropologists who were all over these regions studying these societies, they somehow could not break the ice. And I believe that they couldn't break the ice because these tribes were far too independent for the British. You know, they had their own way of life. They weren't really happy with this sort of domination. And therefore, the British never made a lot of headway with them. They never went into a great amount of dialogue with these tribes and populations right at the outsets. The tribes, therefore, because there was no understanding, um, did not receive any benefits, nor were they beneficiaries of any development because they fell within, a lot of these people fell within these excluded, partially excluded areas. And there was a time when the Indian National Congress, I think it was maybe in the late 1930s, 1935-36, when during one of the annual general meetings, very categorically said that the Congress was of the opinion that this sort of creation of excluded areas is just another attempt to divide the people of India. We must all remember that the divide and rule policy of the British was very successful. And not just was it successful, but it was applied wherever they went. And that's exactly what they did here. Having excluded and partially excluded areas is a way of dividing your community. And, this was unjustifiable on any level. And the Indian National Congress at that point said that this was a discriminatory treatment. And this was a very, this was full of malice because this sort of treatment um, was aimed not towards the benefit of these people, but it was aimed towards keeping these people back. This would prevent any sort of uniform development of this region compared to with the rest of India. It would prevent any sort of uniform development that may have been possible if there wasn't this sort of discrimination. There wasn't this sort of division of lands. Um, and it was very clear at that point as well in history that the separation of these areas was intended for the exploitation of the mineral resources, of the forest wealth, and of the inhabitants of these areas. The Congress at that point, the Indian National Congress at that point, demanded very strongly the ab- abolition of excluded and partially excluded areas because they realized that this was very discriminatory, this was divisive, and this was aimed at keeping people behind. And simply there wouldn't be a uniform development within our nation if these policies that the British had brought in into the Northeast would have continued. Um, there was other opposition as well. It wasn't just the International Congress. Anybody who was concerned for the uniformed development of the country, um, was very concerned with these sort of policies that they were bringing in. But having said that, I feel that the Northeast region and this sheer isolation of these tribes really did very deeply have a psychological impact, but also physical, geographical impact on our country. Um, Number three, step towards isolation. Uh, Another step was the policy of bringing in missionaries. During this period of these debilitating British policies of exclusion and isolation, the only contact the hill tribes were allowed was with the British missionaries, and this was a policy. So they didn't really have a lot of they didn't really have a lot of contact with any other representation of the Indian society, but by the only interaction that they had with any society was the society that the British chose for them to have an interaction with. Let's say David Scott, the first commissioner of Assam, um, who was very clearly of the opinion that these were heathen tribes. He considered the population in the Northeast being fairly backward. He called them rude tribes. Um, he thought that they didn't have any culture of their own, he didn't have any civilization of their own, and that they would benefit by coming in contact with the missionaries, that they would benefit by learning uh, Western ways of life. They would benefit by learning the gospel. And the then Commissioner of Assam, Major Francis Jenkins, also reiterated David Scott's opinion and said that the tribes of the Assam frontier should be brought within the missionary scope of activities, because they also thought at that time that maybe if they had more contact with the missionaries, that they would become more like them. They would become more skilled in the English language. Um, they would uh, they would become more, let's say, human, because they really didn't feel that these were a completely civilized race, unfortunately. And again, this comes back to this very little understanding they had of this very, very evolved civilization, which was very different to theirs. So the British, in their usual way, everything that they thought of, they decided to make it into a policy. And everything they thought was right was inculcated into their administration. So the British then created the Charter Act of 1813, which pretty much stated the importance and necessity of the British administration taking more responsibility for the religious and moral improvement of the people of India. It's a shame. It's an utter shame, and in a way, it's an embarrassment for us that we couldn't really reach out to the British at that point. Of course, there were multiple different reasons, but we couldn't reach out and say, no, we don't need this sort of civilization. We aren't different from anybody else. And this is our culture. But anyhow, this Charter Act firstly asserted the Crown's sovereignty over British India. And secondly, it allowed the free movement of missionaries to teach English and propagate Christianity. And post the Charter Act, there was a determined flow of missionaries to the Northeast region, and as well as the rest of the nation, working hand in hand with the administration. So the administration, these regressive and discriminatory policies, as well as now the missionaries were working hand in hand to create the Northeast region as a separate entity with a separate culture that they have given, a separate language, and they pretty much wiped out the collective historical civilization that we all shared in India. The missionary zeal in this region changed pretty much the social and cultural fabric of the region. They really deconstructed ideas of nationality, identity, as well as the attitude towards the mainstream political process. And I'm sure all of you know this parts of this history, and you know the Simon Commission. So after the visit of the Simon Commission in 1929, um, they decided to very strongly promote their policy and reduce the growing discontent and marginalization amongst the northeastern population uh, by promoting these ideas that they had, which is to, just to remind you, which is number one, the inner line regulation. They kept them alienated, the partially and fully excluded areas. Um, they limited the contact with outsiders, and that pretty much meant Indians. And let me tell you, I read recently, I read a article which said that even post independence, there were regions in the Northeast where Indian sadhus were banned from coming as well. And number three, they brought in missionaries. And to make matters worse, the missionaries did not limit their work to religious conversion, but they also extended it to cultural conversion. The indigenous tribes, of course, we know had their own animistic methods of worship, had their own methods of culture and lifestyle and spirituality. But the missionaries worked very hard to break this. They played a leading role in destroying age old historical, social, cultural, political, spiritual values. Their solutions to many of the problems was with the lens of a Western system, and they ended to create a standardized homogeneous society in sync with the West. However, this sort of religious cultural pomposity started, unfortunately, changing the outlook of the innocent tribals. Um, the missionaries looked, like I said before, upon these tribals as people that they needed to civilize, that weren't civilized in the sense that they would have wished for, which was very sort of Western civilization. And that created also, you see, aspirations. Because if your rulers, people who are authoritative, are coming and telling you that this is not good enough, that are very different, you are, you're very backward and you need to come up to speed with us, it would obviously psychologically play this very insidious game where it would create aspirations for innocent people who believe this to want to be like the Westerners, to want to be like their rulers and not like anybody else. And this prolonged emotional process and building up of ethnic minority based identity became more explicit and became more articulate in the post independent era, and eventually culminated in a lot of unrest and insurgency in the northeastern region. A separate identity that is different from the national identity uh, somehow was created by the missionaries, and through the seeds of separatism, as we have seen many, many times, um, was sown in the Northeast by the British. And this was also by mainstream India seen a lot and largely perceived a lot as a Christian subnational identity consciousness. And of course, it was as well, because if you see a lot of the insurgencies, all these insurgencies, well, not all of them, at least most of them, have some sort of a religious bearing to it. They have a religious foundation to it in the Northeast. But what did this do? This finally, towards the end of the colonial rule, created a lot of problems for us, created a lot of problems not just for the population in the Northeast, but for the population in the rest of India to see each other as the same, to integrate in the way a modern nation should have integrated. Having said that, towards the colonial end, and I will come to my fourth and final blow to the complete psychological integration to the Northeast, was the idea of the crown colony. Means apart from these very racist and very discriminatory policies and administrative techniques that the British employed, there was also, while they were leaving, they were so persistent that they also insisted or thought it would be a good idea to have what was called the crown colony. The British were very reluctant to leave this region. And like I mentioned earlier, this was for obviously very apparent reasons. The region was rich in resources, it was strategically located, um, and they knew what they could reap out of this region. So they decided to carve out a new independent region, which we would be called the Crown Colony, and it would comprise of the hill regions of the Northeast and Burma. And the idea of amalgamating the backward tracts of Assam and Burma was initiated in 1928. Of course, it didn't work out, but we'll come to that a little later. But during the visit of the Simon Commission itself, it had been recommended uh, to separate Burma province from the British Indian Empire. The suggestion was based on the premise that the hill tribes were intrinsically different to the people of the plain. So they thought that they would have parts of the Northeast as well as parts of Burma, and these were the most strategically important parts, and call it the Crown Colony. Um, in the 40s, just before independence, the then governor of Assam, Robert Reed, further proposed um, that this would be a really good idea. He reiterated this idea and said that India's northeast frontier in relation to Tibet, China, Burma, even Japan, which was a greatly aggressive state at the moment at that time, um, would be very, very important to the crown. Reed's plan proposed to cover, the Shan states, the Chittagong Hills of present Bangladesh, into a completely separate political entity under direct control of the crown agent. However, this plan was seen um, as by a lot of people in India fighting for the freedom of India as again an extension of their divide and rule policy, as an extension to separate the Northeast from the rest of India. There was this professor in Oxford University at that time during the discussion of this crown colony, and his name was Reginald. May have heard of him. His name was Reginald Coupland. Um, he made an exhaustive report at the time, and he really, really pushed for the crown colony idea. And he went down to say that because of the racial differences, now see how insidious this is, because majority of the people in the Northeast were of the Mongoloid race, that they were automatically, culturally, ethnically, religiously different from the rest of India. Now, therefore, it is very, very difficult to, separate this sort of roots of alienation and racism of India's modern history to what we are seeing in present day. Fortunately, coming back to the Crown Colony, this plan didn't quite materialize, as we all know. But it took a psychological toll on the tribes in the Northeast. It played a vital role in creating a sense of exclusion and a separate identity consciousness amongst the tribes. This ultimately resulted in the emergence of a lot of separatist activity in the Northeast. Nevertheless, the Crown Colony Plan limited the damage that otherwise would have resulted maybe in another partition. We were this close to it, we would have lost um, a whole civilization, a whole culture of people that is integral to India's ancient history and civilization and collective civilization. We would have lost all of that. We would have lost a natural defense barrier. We would have lost, you know, the culture. We would have lost history. We would have lost accessibility to the Northeast. However, it didn't materialize. But like I said, the psychological impact remained in the minds of Indians, not just in the Northeast, but across the country. And unfortunately for us, the attempts to fix this rift with the formation of different states and pouring of central financial assistance didn't quite help. It didn't bridge the gap that the British created for us. The Northeast has been very, very important um, to successive governments in the country. And more so important, I believe, to this government. But somehow that hasn't really quite helped in amalgamating our people seamlessly. Of course, it's helped to a great extent, and we shouldn't be negative and we should look at the future with a certain amount of positivity. But the British, the damage that they did to our integration was immense. The British policy of physical, emotional, cultural, religious alienation has taken its toll, and we are all paying the price of it. This sort of consciousness of a neo-colonial identity, created a rift. It's simple as that. We might want to deny it. We might want to justify this by saying that, well, it's people are bigoted or not, but it's not true. There is this seed of suspicion that was sown on both ends. And by both ends, I mean the Northeast and the rest of India. And, I think it did a great disservice to a country that was starting off with new hope and, ambition to be safe and secure and integrated after a very long time in our civilization. However, now in present day India, we have to accept that there is this hangover, so as to say, of this British colonial attempt to isolate the Northeast. It may not remain in our modern consciousness and generations to come, and it would be very tragic for us, because if generations to come were to see each other just as bigoted people, it wouldn't really justify. That knowledge would not be complete on why we have these sort of little errors in our interaction. um, but yes, we have to at some point accept that the actions have been uh, very insidiously consequential, of the divide and rule policy, which was so freely practiced by the British. The modern consequence of this history is what we all have to bear with today. which is the Northeast region, not being a part of the common man's imagination. Now, let me also say this, I don't want to sound all dark and without any hope. I have been traveling to the Northeast for many, many years now, over a decade. And I still remember the first time when I visited the Northeast. Um, there were a lot of questions, not just from me to what the Northeast was going to be like. I landed in Guwahati the first time I came, which was about 13, 14 years ago. And there were, of course, a lot of questions about what the Northeast is going to be like. And, a lot of people, my friends, asked me questions, said, oh my God, isn't it very dangerous? And, they had all these strange ideas about eating habits in the Northeast. They couldn't differentiate one state to another. For them, it was the Northeast region. It wasn't Assam, Nagaland, Meghalaya. For them, everybody looked alike, everybody spoke the same language, everybody had the same culture, which of course is not true. But that's the kind of perception people had of the Northeast. Awareness was very little, interaction was even less. We didn't see a lot of people from the Northeast here. Yes, we did see people from Nepal, and people had no idea of the difference. But we didn't see a lot of people from the Northeast in the north of India or in the west of India or in the south of India. And when I traveled to the Northeast for the first time, and I did a lot of travel by road, I realized, oh my God, this is like, that's when it struck me that this is like saying South India, this is like saying North India. And I realized that awareness was very, very low, interaction was very, very low. Having said that, the Northeast of today, as I see it, and so I can compare, uh, is finally emerging in the common man's imagination as a whole unexplored, beautiful region with beautiful people. But as we've seen with these instances of racial attacks, there's still a lot to be done. There's still a lack of in integration. There are biases on both ends. I know that the Northeast. I remember the first time when I came there, there weren't any restaurants. There was no Pizza Hut. There was no fast food chains. There were no restaurants whatsoever. There were some very few local restaurants. I remember in Guwahati there used to be a place we used to go and eat called Paradise. But apart from that, there wasn't anything else. Other states were even lesser developed, like Manipur. I remember traveling, and there was only 4 hours in a day that you could really travel. The rest was under curfew. Um, there weren't any nice hotels, there weren't any nice restaurants, and now I'm seeing that change. Also, what I noticed at that time, there wasn't any tourism. And therefore, I say that, the Northeast today is very quickly emerging in the minds of a common person because I have seen tourism increase. I have seen the need or the expectation of people to want to travel the Northeast. I have seen, restaurants develop, industry develop. Um, which obviously caters and shows you that there are a lot of people that are traveling to the Northeast. But having said that, there's still a lot to be done. And let me also say this that the racism that our country encounters, especially with the Northeast, is not one sided. Of course, we've heard of the instances in the north of India and the south of India. But, the Northeast has its own racial slurs against outsiders. They include, if the North includes slurs like Chinky, you have Mepa, you have Haring, you have Dakar in the Northeast against outsiders. And there are also enough instances of discrimination against non-tribals, non-Northeasterners that have been recorded in the Northeast. They have been asked to leave. There have been instances, Meghalaya. Some other states also have instances like this. There has been racial discrimination, there has been alienation of outsiders. It's a two-way street, and we have a lot of hindrances that we need to overcome. This is why I rely heavily on individual responsibility. This is a huge country. We have a huge population. We have all sorts of people. We have unreasonable expectations from the government to solve all our problems, which is not going to happen. Some problems have to be solved by us. And, I know there are a lot of young people watching this. And I think that expectation lies fairly and squarely on your shoulders. Let me remind you, not long ago, uh, and I'll say this as somebody who has lived in India, lived in Delhi. Um, People had a habit in Delhi of calling everybody from the south Madrasi. There wasn't any distinction between the population in the south, the variety of culture, languages. There was no awareness, but with pursued interest in integration, uh, the Southern capability to compete as equals, their success in the IT sector is pretty much all signs of discrimination. They worked very very well. They developed themselves very well. There was some sort of unanimous structure within them. Um, they created great tourist spots. Those tourist spots have become hugely successful. They turned back to their roots and created what they were naturally good at, like, let's say, meditation camps, religion, Ayurvedic spots. They converted their coffee plantations into successful businesses. They made a mark for themselves in IT. They promoted their food and their festivals, so on and so forth. They pretty much opened themselves up to the country. Whereas, and don't take this in a way of, you know, us pointing fingers at each other, but this is a constructive discussion. And as somebody who has first-hand experience of the Northeast and has first-hand experience of living in pretty much most of the parts of India, I'd say this, that I see a lot of the Northeast citizens, my friends, who tend to remain in a ghetto like situation in North India. You know, there is this sort of ghetto mentality. There are so many settled in Delhi. And to give you a prime example, um, there are so many Northeastern kids from all the different states who study here, who work here, who are at different colleges, universities. Some of them are even running their businesses here. But you never see them in the mainstream. This is a ghetto mentality. They interact with each other, they live together, they eat together, they speak in their native languages, marry each other. This is not a very constructive way of integration. You've come so far away from your homes, you need to mingle. If you don't mingle, you don't break these barriers. You should want to learn more from other cultures, and other cultures should be given an opportunity to learn more from you. Cultural distinction has never been a problem for India. That's why so many cultures and so many ethnicities, how many? Over 2,000 ethnicities and over 600 um, tribes have come together to form a modern nation. But if there is going to be this sort of personal barrier, then larger barriers are never going to be overcome. The more familiarity that one has with each other, the less sense of otherness you have. I have also seen a resistance by many of my Northeastern friends to speak Hindi. Now, this is absurd to me. If communities in the Northeast can speak English, which is not native to them, then where is the problem in speaking Hindi? I come from a family that is not from Delhi. My parents are not Hindi speakers. I didn't grow up in a house where we spoke Hindi. But I actually speak Hindi really well, and I take great pride in the fact that I can speak my national language. And these petty differences can only be a hindrance to any sort of integration, and one has to look at the bigger picture, not at these small pictures. So we must look down and we must condemn people who bring about these small, you know, petty differences because it harms the larger unity of the country. Of course, then there is the question of education and what the authorities can do to prevent and mitigate such issues of racial crimes throughout the country. Um, a lot of steps have been taken by authorities. For example, in Delhi, we have a dedicated police service for Northeastern students. We have Northeastern helplines. We have communities that support Northeastern students. Though I wonder if we have the same for our population in the Northeast. But having said that, there are a lot of steps that have been taken, which I'm sure we can discuss more during our question hour session or a different time in our interaction. But I think I will end my talk here today and discuss a few other points as you bring them up. But just to conclude, I'd like to say that it is our individual responsibility, really, to respect the fact that we have very ancient historical ties and emotions that run deep in a country as ancient as ours. And we must overcome our small biases and slights and work towards that. And understand that we are an ancient unified civilization unlike any other in the world. That these biases, these differences, are you know are a construct of the history that we've had to suffer through. And as a country with a diverse and large population as we have to individually work harder and fulfill higher goals for our country and for ourselves. A strong and unified nation is the necessity of a standardized higher culture. And if we want to get there, then there is absolutely no space for alienation of our own fellow citizens, whoever they might be and wherever they might be. Whether it's in the north, whether it's in the south, whether it's in the northeast. Um, we have to understand our history. We have to understand the roots of this discrimination. We have to understand that this is not of our own making. It is a psychological construct, and it is in our hands today to be able to overcome these differences um, just by um, keeping our eyes on the greater common good. And with that, I'd like to end my talk, and I'd be very happy to take some questions if you have some. Any questions? I see some comments. I'd be happy to. Absolutely, but Hindi is also a language of that binds country together. We have to understand the importance. There's somebody who's said that Hindi is not our national language. There is no national language mentioned in the Indian Constitution. See, now this is what we need to overcome. It's not about, oh my God, this language is from the north and that language is from the south. This is a widely spoken language. Hindi and English are two widely spoken languages, and if you have no problem speaking English, you should have no problem speaking Hindi if that really is important to you. If you really think that you need to create tools that will overcome these distinctions and biases. It's individual responsibility. I have another question uh, from Dhyan. It says, "Ma'am, do you think racism is inborn or is it taught to us? And do you think if British had a hand in communal racism that is seen in India today?" I think if British had a hand in communal racism. Well, from what I understand, Dhyan, of your question, I personally don't think racism, you can be born with any sort of biases. I don't think people are born bigots, but I think there is how you weave your history, how you interact with your fellow citizens, how much awareness that there is. That is also important in creating our perception of other. Um, and what was your second question, Dhyan? Um, and do you think if British had a hand in communal India today? That's exactly what I said. That it might not be in our modern imagination that these areas or this sort of lack of assimilation and integration was created by the British. But that is why it is important to know our history. We cannot keep blaming each other. There has to be some responsibility that has to be on the shoulders of the predecessors. And of course, the British had a role in racism, as I have just explained. And you have to understand that, the minute you have limitations and barriers of access, if I cannot access you as easily as I can access another person in the same country, you automatically become distant to me. So I hope that answers your question, Dhyan. I'm going to take another question, and you can ask me a follow-up question if you'd like. Um, there's one by Uttara Roy, which says, "Do you think that it is because of the political issues that the people started to discriminate the Northern people, or is it because of the lack of knowledge regarding the Northeast culture?" Uttara, that's a good question, but I did answer a part of it in my talk. Of course, we have to look at these issues of racism, um, not just in terms of the last 10 years or the last 20 years, but like I said, we have to look at the role of British policies in creating such a distance between us. Having said that, of course, later on, politics played a role as well, and politics still plays a role. But if um, uh, if a nation feels integrated, has mutual faith and trust, I think you would be able to overcome a lot of these political biases. But having said that, there is a lack of knowledge, and that lack of knowledge, like I reiterate, is also because of the policies that the British brought in. I remember 10 years ago when I used to travel to the Northeast, and I'd asked my friends to travel with me. The ILP was a major point of, point for them to not go any further. It seems like one more step. B, it seems like you're going into, it has a psychological nuance of you going into an unknown territory. So of course, it is lack of knowledge, but why has this lack of knowledge happened is what we must question. There's another question by ma'am, is there Jita Gupta Nandi, ma'am, is there any specific reasons that have caused an increase in the Northeast people facing racism in the country in spite of doing quite well? Of course, and the answers to this comes again within the purview of my talk, which Lee has said that the North Indians or the South Indians or any of these other communities in India did not have access to the Northeast. They were left. They were left behind. The Northeast was left behind by these policies, which were not changed for years. and it's very, very important to understand that there has been a huge gap. Even today, our education system is not the same. Of course, that is a completely different topic, and that is a very, very large topic, and that would make a topic of its own. But um, you know that also at some point needs to be addressed, because there is some amount of uniformity that is needed. And, like I said, it is also important for Northeasterners to realize that you are not an island. You cannot want to integrate. And I have seen this, that people in the Northeast are very resistant to suggestions. You mustn't be resistant to suggestions. I'm not saying that there aren't a couple of there aren't people in other parts of India that aren't just plain stupid. But majority of the people aren't like that. Majority of the people have a lack of interaction. They have a lack of awareness, and I also know a majority of the people who are very interested to get to know the Northeast better. But there is a lack of opportunities as well. So, the individual responsibility is also on your shoulders to welcome these people, just the way it is on the shoulders of the people in the north or the south or the west to welcome you. This is one country, and we have to start behaving like that, before we can start feeling it. Disha, thank you for saying that that's a rational view on language issues, because I really do think that language is important. I know my own mother language, and my mother's mother tongue is different. My father speaks a different language. I know both of them, but along with that, I also know Hindi. I also know English. So I don't think it should offend us at all. Um, Kasturi. Kasturi, you are asking me the same question that I've just answered, which is, what are the reasons that the mainlanders of India still discriminate against the Northeast people? Um, I'm going to make this very short because I've answered this before. But like I said, the historical perspective makes a very big difference. The policies that you have created a distance. I never had any problem entering any other place in any part of my country except in the Northeast. I understand that in the Northeast you see an ILP as something that is protecting your interests. But along with that, unfortunately, it's like a double-edged sword. It's also not just protecting your interests, but it's also creating a little bit of a distance. But having said that, I reiterate, of course, there will always be those few who will be just plain, simply bigoted, and I have faced that bigotry as well, whether it's in the Northeast, whether it's abroad. I have faced that as well. But I don't see that as the general perception and the mainstream leaning of Indians. I don't think Indians by nature, all of India, that includes North, South, East, West, I don't think Indians by nature are discriminatory. Ma'am, is there a way to stop all of this? Yes, now that's a good question as well. Um, you know, Apart from the fact that there is a lot of historical, impact on racism, there's a lot of political impact on racism, there's a lot of policy related issues that impact racism, but that doesn't mean we can ignore it. That doesn't mean that we can say, oh yeah, when people develop and when people evolve more, and when the Northeast becomes more open, and when people start traveling here more, it'll go away on its own. No, of course, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything to prevent it. It's very important to make examples out of people. Now, let's say in Delhi police, we have a special coordinator for the Northeast, who coordinates between the police and any Northeasterner having a problem. so that their complaints can be taken easily, so that they don't face any problems at police stations, so that they don't feel alienated in any way. Um, they also have a full-fledged police unit now. So the police unit is called SPU. No, what is it called? Yeah, it's a special police unit, SPUNER, which has special vans and has special police patrolling that is specifically for northeastern kids. And we have a nodal officer. The Delhi police has also, very impressively so, and we must also compliment where somebody deserves it, and Delhi police does deserve it. They have also started recruiting northeasterners into Delhi police, and I think that's a really, really good move, because if this is the problem that somebody from the Northeast faces, then the solutions must come from within. Uh, we already apparently have about 30 to 35 police officers. I think if this is replicated in other states, and other states, especially states where we have a larger concentration of northeastern people, then I think that would be a benefit. But I also think that Farhana, I also think that um, there are more steps that can be taken. For example, I think student exchange programs. I think there has to be more interactiveness, and I think you guys are doing such a great job. Out of this organization, because it's bringing minds together. Um, so I think not just student exchange programs where northeastern students come here, and students from other parts of India go to the northeast, but also I think finally we will have to look at our textbooks. We will have to look at what we learn. What we learn throughout India has to be uniformed, and the history we learn, the geography that we learn, you know the civics that we learn. Anthropology is also very important, because India, and this will benefit all of India, not just the Northeast, because the kind of cultural diversity that we have. We are so rich in cultural diversity. We are so rich in civilizational history that it's really important for us to know all of that. And I think that will happen when our books change, our textbooks change, our board examinations are uniformed. So, Farhana, I hope that answers your question to a certain extent. Nivedita. Nivedita says, I'm sitting with my family right now, and I totally understand the thing you said, ma'am. And yes, there are personal discriminations within it. From Arunachal, and we call Haring to only those who are non-tribal. It's not that we are discriminating them. Nivedita, of course it isn't, and of course, I wouldn't say that, a lot of people do it out of some sort of personal discrimination. But you have to also be sensitive. And I'm not just saying this, and mind you, don't take this personally. I'm not just saying this to you or to anybody from the Northeast. I'm saying this to people from other parts of India also. A lot of people who are maybe less educated or maybe not that aware in other parts of India also have a habit of saying chinki or Nepali hai. I mean, that also they might say it out of not being aware of it being a part of their language. Like in North India, calling somebody with I've been called a Nepali, I've been called a chinky as well. you know but having said that, I've been called a bahadur also. So it's funny to me, but I'm sure it isn't to a lot of people. So you have to understand that these are sensitivity issues as well. Let's uh, question. Ma'am, do you think that the lack of development and focus on Northeast by the government post independence can be a cause of alienation of this? Harsh, that's a good question, because I've often thought about it. I think what happened after independence is that we didn't really revisit any of the rules and regulations. We didn't really consider, like let's say the ILP is an ancient rule. We didn't consider these rules and regulations. There was a lack of political will, and there was also a lot of insurgency, and there was a sense of separatism. You see, separatism also post independence has done a little damage to integration of the Northeast, with a complete integration, I'd say, of the Northeast to the rest of India. Because there was a time when I was younger, we used to look at the Northeast as a bed of insurgency. Nobody would want to go there because you think everybody was a separatist and they wouldn't like you, to put it in very simple words. So, yes, political will has been a major blow to us, and it's not just been like I pointed out with British policies, but it's also been our fault to not overturn a lot of those British policies that have become useless to us. I hope that answers your question, Harsh. Um, in the light, this is a Jitata, I think, answered a question from you. So let me take somebody else's first, and then if there's a little time, I'll take yours again. Uh, there, there is a very nice comment by Shubham Das. He says Hindi is a direct descendant of Sanskrit through Prakrit and Upper Brahmsha. It has been influenced and enriched by Dravidian, Turkish, Farsi, Arabic, Portuguese, and English. It's a very expressive language. In poetry and songs, it can convey emotions using simple and gentle words. It can also be used to exact and rational reason. Yes, Shubham. Hindi is a very expressive word. It is a shame that not many people speak it fluently nowadays, but I think it's a language that has a lot of power. And I remember when I was studying abroad many, many years ago, uh, there was a lot of interest by people, by the Westerners, in the Indian languages I knew, because they were interested in knowing what I brought to the table, which was my own culture, my own land, my own Indianness. So I think we must take pride in that. Um, Sham, you said something. What's your view on imposing so-called democratic reforms to the culture led to the increase the issues of discrimination even after getting independence? Could you elaborate that? I'm not quite understand. Um, Saptarishi asks, we studied in history that the British was resisted by the Rajputs as well as the Marathas and was retaliated by the British as well. Yet, why was the resistance by the Northeast tribes became a ground of divide and rule from the rest of India? Well, you know, um, if you're asking me why resistance, um, why the British had such a sort of embedded interest in the Northeast, then, like I said in my talk, the Northeast is a very important place. You must see that the land that you belong to is possibly the most strategic place in geopolitics. Um, you have a vantage if you have the Northeast. You have a vantage point. You can defend yourself against China, Burma. It is the gateway to Southeast Asia, and the British realized this very early on. They realized also that a large part of the Northeast was exploitable. They weren't as politically motivated. They weren't as you know they weren't as uh, politically involved as the Marathas were, the Rajputs were. They had been engaging with the British for a long time, and that is what differentiated the Northeasterners from the rest of India. So yes, Northeast was a very special region, and a lot of people from the British administration recognized that, and that's why it became, a different ball game altogether. Also, that they had few ambitions. They wanted to keep that crown colony. You see, the British don't have at that point, they didn't have a base in Southeast Asia. So this would have been the perfect base. Of course, later on they went into South Korea and all. That's a different thing. But at that point, they didn't have a base in Southeast Asia. So this would have been very important to them. Shilpi says, I always see that most of the uneducated things are done by the educated ones. Don't know why, but just hope a day will come when everyone will surely understand the meaning of equality. Shilpi, absolutely. I think we all hope for that. We all wish that. And, being educated, Shilpi, is not really, it's no equivalence for being a aware, good person. Anybody can be educated. I don't think that makes your character or the national character of the country. um, Ahmad Laskar, he says, ma'am, why the government does not take this seriously? This clearly can't be about strong government support. Again, Shehab, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. You have to appreciate where appreciation is due. I think we also have to draw a difference between the present government and the previous governments. I think the Act East policy is a great indication of the importance that is being given to the Northeast. I think our Prime Minister has shown many a times how important the Northeast and the people of Northeast are. We have Kiran Rijiju on one of the most important posts in the country. So I don't think the government is taking it lightly at all. And like I mentioned earlier, even uh, the law is now taking cognizance of the fact that the Northeasterners have to be protected. But like I said, we have to take individual responsibility. We have to make more of an effort to get to know other people, to integrate, to be friends, to socialize, to be a part of non-northeastern organizations, and I think that would help us a lot. um, Sadiq says that clear that the system on eradicating this sort of biases is not functioning properly. Like I said, this is a huge country. We have a large population. There are always going to be some people who are just not going to know any better. But is that the majority sentiment of people? I don't think so. And can we just lay the responsibility on government shoulders? I don't think so either. So, I think yes, it's true that we must deal with it very seriously, and we must deal with it on both ends very seriously. There shouldn't be any sort of racism amongst anybody in the country. This is one unified country, and we have to accept our shared civilization. There's no two ways about it. But let me also say that I think as we mature as a democracy, as we mature as a nation, I think a lot of these issues are going to be laid to rest because the newer generation is far more open minded than the earlier generations were. The Northeast has opened up far more in the last 10 years, and I've seen it with my own eyes than ever before, and that's just going to continue. So I think, we shouldn't have a blanket blame. We should look at these as situational. We should not label everything racist attack. We must go down. It's very important to go down deeply into what the reason of the attack was. Yes, some of them are apparently just racist attacks. I will not deny that. But one of the instances I remember, there was a road rage incident, and that incident came out to be just a simply a road rage incident. It could have happened with me, it could have happened with you, it could have happened with everybody. So we must be very careful also, and with responsibility. Yes, we want to call a spade, but we must know everything about that spade before we call it a spade. Um, what um, Joy Aditya Phukan says students must be taken to the historical sites where the battles of Shiva and Vishnu occurred and Krishna horse rested. And excursion trips or field trips and correct history should be taught. Absolutely. That's why, right at the beginning of my talk, I brought in our ancient civilizational connect and our mentions in our Purans about the Northeast, because the Northeast is not interaction that we know today. The Northeast is a very, very crucial part of what we would consider Bharat, and very deep connections with each other. Whether some of us like it, whether some of us don't, this is the fact. Um, yes, Shilpi, you can file a petition. You know, law is very strict on these matters, and I think all of you are from the background of law. I think there are very important suggestions that all of you can make. You are from the Northeast, you know your law, you're going to be the future gatekeepers of our legal system. So I think it is very important that you, through this organization, or through an informal way, you create a intentional policy, some sort of intent paper on what you would see, what you would like to see be the changes in our law, what would you think would be preventive measures for racism. But remember, it can't be case specific to the Northeast, it has to be pan India. Saptarishi, ma'am, in your opinion, with regard to the racism, should the Northeast people take strong stand towards these, or should we take the pathway of ahimsa? Of course, you should take a strong stand. Ahimsa is has very connotations for very different situations. We must also not tolerate anything that is wrong, that is done to us. And somebody being racially discriminatory towards one person, it's not just that one person, it is the whole community that person is being racially discriminatory against. But having said that, you must always follow the law. You must never allow fingers to be pointed at you. So you must follow the law, take the right course of action, and come out with not just complaining and teaching the other person a lesson, but have a larger perspective of how this can be interjected right at this point. And um, yes, it's very, very important that we have more interactive sessions like this. Thank you, Farhana. I just saw your comment. It's nice to know that you enjoyed the session. But I think, we've overshot time, and I enjoyed it very much. Questions were very deep and very informative for me. But yes, Nivedita, I know that ILP is there in some places, it isn't there in some places, but like I call it a double edged sword. That I do understand it's for your protection, but it has its own other limitations as well. I remember, like I mentioned before, when my friends wanted to travel, the minute they saw ILP, they kind of changed their minds because they didn't want to show their documentation again. They understand why they needed a permit to go into their own country. They had this confusion: does it have a different government? Are there different rules and regulations? So you see, everybody is not going to know everything about these regulations, these policies, as much as because you're from there, so you understand its value. But that doesn't mean that other people will understand. They might look at it from a different perspective, and we have to be, fortunately or unfortunately, open to that. Mm, yes, and I had heard about the Chinese boy, but he's come back, fortunately. Um, Shivi, I haven't taken a question from you, so I'm going to make this my last question. Resonate in this pandemic in spite of the fact that I don't quite understand what you're trying to say. It says no racism is at least prevailing in the country presently in terms of this pandemic, in spite of the fact that the government is not getting that much support, isn't it? Um, I think we've seen some cases of racism against um, our fellow citizens from the Northeast, and that is why I decided to talk about this because I don't think, Shivi, that this government especially has any dearth of intent in bridging the gap that has been created by our age-old policies. But unfortunately, we've seen these instances of racial discrimination, which have been awful to hear, and it has been in the light of Corona coming in from China, and it should be in no uncertain terms be objected to. I don't think these are things that you can take lying down. I think all that we do is ensure that we know our history, ensure that we know that nobody is different to each other and that people cannot dent our confidence. It is important for us to know that we are equal in the eyes of our society and the eyes of our law, and that if there are issues like this, they have their roots in history, they have their roots in regressive policies, and as we grow and as we learn, we must make a very concerted effort to overturn these policies, these laws, these regulations that don't serve us anymore. And we must make a very, very heartfelt attempt to bridge these gaps, to integrate more on all ends. So, thank you so much. And I will be very happy if anybody wants to ask me any questions on my Twitter, uh, on my Facebook, though I don't think I can add any more people on Facebook, but I'll be very happy to answer any questions. You can email me, you can add me on Twitter, and I hope to be in touch. So thank you very much, and thank you to Rachit for being so helpful, and best of luck with your organization, and I hope to be back soon. Thank you.